Margaret Sullivan bought the surplus corrugated iron sheets from the bankrupt mining operation in Helena in March 1881, and when her neighbors in Montana Territory found out what the widow planned to do with them, they were certain grief had finally broken her mind. Not just made her sad, actually broken her mind. Because Margaret wasn't planning to use the corrugated iron for a roof or a barn or equipment storage, the sensible uses for the heavy metal sheets that occasionally became available when businesses failed. She was planning to build a complete curved metal shell over her existing cabin, wrapping the entire structure in iron like some kind of protective cocoon. A widow, living alone, building a metal shell over her home with her own hands. People didn't just think it was strange. They thought it was the behavior of a woman who'd lost her grip on reality after her husband's death. Margaret Sullivan was 34 years old in 1881, a blacksmith's widow who'd been in Montana Territory since 1876. Her husband James had died 18 months earlier in a mine accident, leaving her with a solid cabin, 40 acres, basic tools, and the choice between returning east to family or surviving alone on the frontier. She'd chosen to stay, and she'd spent her first winter alone, learning exactly how brutal Montana cold could be for a woman managing a cabin and livestock by herself. The cabin James had built was good by frontier standards. Squared logs, decent chinking, a large stone fireplace, real glass windows. But during the savage cold of January 1880, Margaret had nearly died trying to keep herself and her animals alive. She'd burned wood faster than she could split it. She'd wrapped herself in every blanket she owned and still shivered through the nights. She'd watched her breath frost in the air despite a fire that consumed her winter fuel supply at terrifying rates. And she'd made a decision. If she was going to survive alone on the frontier, she needed a cabin that worked better than conventional construction allowed. Margaret had an advantage most frontier women didn't. She'd spent 10 years watching her husband work iron. James Sullivan had been a skilled blacksmith, and Margaret had absorbed knowledge about metalworking, heat properties, and how iron behaved in different conditions. She understood that metal could be shaped, joined, and used in ways most homesteaders never considered. When the Helena Mining Company went bankrupt and auctioned its equipment and materials, Margaret rode 40 miles to examine what they were selling. Among the items were 200 square feet of corrugated iron sheeting, heavy-gauge metal with the distinctive wavy pattern that provided strength and flexibility. Most bidders wanted the iron for roofing small buildings. Margaret wanted it for something nobody had attempted, creating a protective metal shell over her entire cabin to trap heat and shield the structure from Montana's brutal weather. She bought the iron sheets for $48, nearly half her savings, and arranged transport back to her property. When neighbors learned what she'd purchased and why, the reaction was immediate and harsh. "Margaret, you're a widow trying to do metal work," said Robert Chen, a farmer who'd been friendly with James. "This isn't women's work. This isn't even normal men's work. You're planning something dangerous and complicated that you don't have the skills to complete." "I watched James work metal for 10 years. I understand how iron behaves. Watching isn't doing, and even if you could work the iron, what you're describing makes no sense. Wrapping your cabin in metal won't make it warmer. It'll make it colder. Metal conducts cold directly into your home. Metal with an air gap between it and the cabin walls will create insulation. The gap will trap warm air and prevent heat loss." Robert shook his head. "Margaret, I think grief has affected your judgment. You're spending money you can't afford on a scheme that won't work, attempting labor you're not strong enough to perform. Please reconsider this before you hurt yourself or waste resources you need to survive." But Margaret had already calculated the risks. The worst outcome was spending $48 and discovering the system didn't work, in which case she'd still have corrugated iron she could use for other purposes. The best outcome was creating a cabin that could keep her warm through winter without burning herself into poverty on firewood. She started construction in April 1881, working alone because no man in the territory would help a widow with what they considered a delusional project. Several men had offered conditionally. "I'll help you build a normal addition to your cabin," Robert Chen had said, "or help you improve your barn. But I won't help you waste money and labor on this metal shell scheme. I can't be part of something I know will fail." Others had been more direct. "Margaret, women don't do construction work. It's not proper and it's not safe. You'll hurt yourself and prove nothing." So Margaret worked alone, and the work was more brutal than she'd anticipated. Each corrugated iron sheet weighed nearly 40 pounds and measured 8 feet by 3 feet. That meant 200 square feet of iron, translated to roughly 50 individual sheets, each one heavy, unwieldy, and dangerous if dropped. Margaret had to move them from the transport wagon to her work site, store them to prevent rust, and eventually position them on the framework she would build, all while maintaining her property, tending livestock, splitting firewood, managing cooking and cleaning, and handling the 100 other tasks that frontier survival required. The first challenge was building the framework itself. Margaret needed to construct a wooden structure of posts and curved ribs around her entire cabin, creating a second skeleton that would support the iron sheets while maintaining a precise 4-foot air gap between the cabin walls and the metal exterior. She started by setting posts in the ground around her cabin's perimeter, spacing them 8 feet apart to match the length of the iron sheets. Each post had to be sunk 3 feet deep to prevent frost heave and movement. Margaret dug the holes by hand with a post hole digger, working in the still cold April ground that fought every shovelful. Her hands, unused to this kind of labor, developed blisters within days. The blisters burst and bled. Margaret wrapped her hands in cloth and kept working. She couldn't afford to stop. She had maybe 5 months before snow, and the framework alone would take most of that time if she worked at the pace her body allowed. After the posts were set, Margaret had to create the curved ribs that would form the half-cylinder shape of the metal shell. This required selecting straight saplings, steaming them to make them flexible, and bending them into arcs that would create the proper curve. James had taught her this technique for creating curved metal forms, but doing it alone with wood was harder than she'd expected. She built a steam box using scrap lumber and heated rocks, soaking the saplings until they were pliable, then bending them over a form she'd created and securing them until they dried in the curved shape. Each rib took a full day to create. She needed 16 ribs to span the 44-foot length of her cabin. That was 16 days, just creating the curved pieces, not counting the failures, ribs that cracked during bending, ribs that didn't hold their curve, ribs that were too weak to support the iron's weight. By late May, Margaret had the basic framework complete. Posts set in the ground, curved ribs attached to create the half-cylinder form, cross-bracing to prevent the structure from racking in wind. The framework alone represented 6 weeks of punishing labor, and she'd lost visible weight. Her clothes hung loose, her face had become gaunt, her hands were calloused and scarred. Sarah Henderson visited during this phase and was horrified by Margaret's appearance. "You look like you've aged 5 years in 2 months. Margaret, this work is destroying you. Your hands are ruined. You've lost so much weight you look ill. Please stop this before you kill yourself." "I'm not dying, I'm working hard." There's a difference between hard work and self-destruction. What you're doing is the latter. You're a widow trying to do work that normally requires multiple men, and you're doing it while also maintaining a homestead alone. Your body can't sustain this. Margaret looked at her friend honestly. "You're probably right. This is probably more than one person should attempt. But Sarah, I don't have the choice of multiple people. I have myself. So I do what I can with what I have. And when you collapse from exhaustion, when you drop one of those 40-pound iron sheets and it breaks your foot or crushes your hand, what then? Then I'll deal with that problem when it happens. But I can't stop because of problems that might occur. I can only keep working on the problems I'm trying to solve." Sarah left shaking her head, and Margaret knew her friend was writing to family back east describing Margaret's deteriorating condition and predicting disaster. But Margaret kept working. Through June, she began attaching the corrugated iron sheets to the framework. This was the most dangerous phase, lifting 40-pound sheets overhead while standing on a ladder, positioning them precisely on the curved ribs, and securing them with bolts while maintaining her balance. She developed a system using ropes and pulleys. She'd tie ropes to the corners of an iron sheet, run the ropes over the framework's peak, and use her body weight on the other end to lift the sheet. Once the sheet was roughly in position, she'd climb the ladder and guide it into final placement, then bolt it to the ribs. The system worked, but it was precarious and exhausting. Each sheet took approximately 2 hours to position and secure, 2 hours of lifting, climbing, balancing, and bolting. With 50 sheets to install, that meant roughly 100 hours of the most dangerous work Margaret had ever attempted. And the dangers were real. In mid-June, she lost her grip on a sheet she was positioning. The 40 pounds of corrugated iron fell 8 feet and landed corner first on her left foot. The pain was immediate and intense. Margaret gasped and collapsed, clutching her foot and fighting not to scream. She sat on the ground for 10 minutes, breathing through the pain, checking for broken bones. Her foot swelled rapidly and hurt badly enough that she wondered if she'd fractured something. But she could move her toes. She could put some weight on it. Probably not broken, just badly bruised. Margaret wrapped the foot tightly, took a day to rest it, and then went back to work. She couldn't afford a serious injury, so she became more careful. But she also couldn't afford to stop, so she kept lifting iron sheets and climbing ladders on a foot that throbbed with every step. Neighbors who rode by during this phase watched with expressions that had evolved from pity to something approaching horror. A widow, visibly injured, working alone on a bizarre metal structure that looked increasingly like an industrial accident rather than intentional construction. Robert Chen stopped by in early July and found Margaret on a ladder, bolting an iron sheet to the framework with hands that shook from exhaustion. "Margaret, please come down. We need to talk." She climbed down carefully, favoring her injured foot, and faced her neighbor with an expression that dared him to criticize. "I'm not here to criticize," Robert said gently. "I'm here to tell you that people are worried, not mocking, genuinely worried. You're hurt, you're exhausted, you're attempting something dangerous alone. We're afraid you're going to seriously injure yourself or worse. I appreciate the concern, but Robert, I can't stop. If I stop, I don't finish before snow. If I don't finish before snow, I face another winter in a cabin that nearly killed me. I have to keep working. Let me help you. I still think this system won't work, but I can't watch you hurt yourself doing heavy labor alone. Let me at least help you lift and position the iron sheets. The rest you can do yourself, but the lifting is too dangerous for one person." Margaret felt emotion rise in her throat, the first offer of actual help she'd received. "You'd help even though you think it's doomed to fail. I'd help because you're my neighbor and you're in danger. Whether the system works is separate from whether you deserve help staying safe during construction." From that day, Robert came twice a week to help Margaret lift and position iron sheets. The work went faster and safer. Margaret could focus on precise positioning and secure bolting while Robert managed the heavy lifting. They didn't talk much. Robert still thought the project was doomed, and Margaret was too tired for conversation. But his presence made the work survivable. By late July, the metal shell was taking its final bizarre form. Approximately 40 of the 50 iron sheets were installed, creating a corrugated metal half-cylinder that covered most of the cabin. The structure looked profoundly strange, a normal frontier cabin disappearing inside a massive curved metal shell, like some kind of industrial cocoon. Sarah Henderson, another widow who'd returned east after her husband died, visited in May and was horrified by what she saw. "Margaret, this is killing you. You've lost weight. Your hands are cut and bruised. You're working yourself to death on something that won't even function. Please, stop this madness and come east with me. You have family in Pennsylvania. You don't have to destroy yourself trying to survive alone out here." Margaret paused in her work. She'd been trying to lift a heavy iron sheet into position and looked at her friend honestly. "Sarah, I can't leave. This land, this cabin, James and I built this together. If I leave, everything we worked for is gone. I have to try to make this work." "But this," Sarah gestured at the bizarre structure taking shape. "A metal shell over your cabin. Margaret, even if you complete it, even if you survive the construction, it won't work. You'll have spent your savings and your health on something that fails the first time you need it. Then I'll know I tried everything possible. But Sarah, I think it will work. The air gap will insulate. The metal will protect. I think this will let me survive here." Sarah left, shaking her head, and Margaret knew her friend was going back east, telling everyone that Margaret Sullivan had lost her mind to grief and isolation. By July, Margaret had the framework complete and was beginning to attach the corrugated iron sheets. This was the most dangerous part, lifting 40-pound metal sheets overhead, positioning them on the curved framework, and bolting them securely while working alone. She developed a system using ropes and pulleys to lift the sheets. She built temporary supports to hold them in place while she bolted them. She worked early mornings and late evenings when the metal wasn't sun-heated, and slowly, painfully, the metal shell took shape around her cabin. The structure looked increasingly strange as more iron went up. From certain angles, it appeared that Margaret had built her cabin inside a giant metal tube. From others, it looked like an industrial warehouse had been dropped over a frontier home. The curved, corrugated iron created a half-cylinder that arched over the cabin, protecting it completely, but looking deeply unnatural. People came from 20 miles away to stare at the bizarre construction. Some brought their families, treating it like a spectacle. They stood in groups discussing whether Margaret was insane, tragic, or simply desperate enough to try anything. A newspaper man from the territorial newspaper rode out and interviewed Margaret while sketching the structure. "Mrs. Sullivan, people are saying this construction is the work of a woman driven mad by grief and isolation. How do you respond?" "I respond that I'm solving a practical problem using knowledge I gained from my husband. Grief didn't teach me about metal and heat transfer. James did. But why this particular solution? Why not simply improve your cabin's insulation conventionally? Because conventional insulation has limits. The air gap between cabin and metal shell provides better insulation than any amount of material stuffed into walls. And the metal shell protects the cabin from wind and weather, which extends the cabin's life. Your neighbors predict this will fail. They say you'll be colder in winter, not warmer. My neighbors build the same way everyone has always built. I'm trying something different because conventional building nearly killed me last winter. If different fails, I'll learn something. But I don't think it will fail." The article that appeared described Margaret's project as a widow's desperate gambit and included extensive quotes from neighbors predicting disaster. The article concluded, "Whether Mrs. Sullivan's unusual construction proves ingenious or tragic will be determined when winter tests her metal-wrapped cabin." By late August, the structure was complete. Margaret had enclosed the ends of the metal shell with wooden walls containing her door and windows. She'd built ventilation, openings at the base and peak that would allow air circulation through the gap. The entire system was designed to trap heat in winter while ventilating in summer. From outside, the completed structure looked profoundly strange. A massive curved iron shell, roughly 44 feet long and 30 feet wide, with wooden end walls. It looked nothing like a home and everything like an industrial building. From inside the cabin, surprisingly, everything looked normal. The cabin itself was unchanged. The only difference was that the exterior walls were now interior walls, with 4 feet of airspace and a metal shell beyond them. Margaret built small access hatches so she could enter the air gap for inspection and maintenance. The first time she crawled into the space with a lantern, she felt vindicated. The construction was solid, the ventilation was working, and the system appeared functional. But she knew the real test would come in winter. The first serious cold hit in November 1881. Temperature dropped to 8 below zero overnight, cold but not extreme by Montana standards. Margaret lit her fireplace at a moderate rate, using less wood than she'd burned during previous winters. Then she waited to see what would happen. The cabin warmed faster than it ever had before. Within an hour, the temperature inside reached 62 degrees. The walls felt warm to the touch instead of radiating cold. The heat that would normally escape through the cabin walls was instead bleeding into the 4-foot air gap, creating a buffer zone of warmer air. Margaret crawled into the gap with a thermometer and took readings. The air temperature in the gap had settled around 48 degrees, dramatically warmer than the outside air, but cooler than the cabin interior. This moderate temperature buffer was insulating the cabin, preventing direct heat loss to the frozen exterior. The system was working. Better than working. It was transforming how the cabin responded to cold. Margaret used roughly half the firewood she'd burned during the previous winter's comparable cold, and the cabin was warmer. But Margaret didn't tell her neighbors. She wanted to see how the system performed in extreme cold before making any claims. The extreme test came in January 1882, when a blizzard struck Montana territory with violence that would kill livestock, collapse buildings, and claim lives across the region. It started on January 14th as light snow, nothing unusual for Montana winter. Margaret went about her normal morning routine, feeding her chickens and cow, splitting firewood, checking that her cabin was secure. The sky was grey, but not threatening. By noon, the character of the storm had changed. The light snow became heavy snow. The wind picked up from the northwest, building from a breeze to sustained gusts that made standing difficult. By 2 in the afternoon, visibility was dropping rapidly. Margaret brought her animals into the small barn, gave them extra feed, and secured every door and shutter on her property. She'd survived enough frontier winters to recognize a serious storm building, and she made preparations accordingly. By evening, it was a full blizzard. Wind howled around Margaret's metal-wrapped cabin with sustained violence, but the sound was different from previous winters. Instead of the wind screaming directly against cabin walls and finding every gap in the chinking, the wind was hitting the metal shell first. The sound was muffled, filtered, like the storm was happening one layer removed from her living space. Temperature dropped to 26 below zero the first night and continued falling. Margaret woke on January 15th to a world transformed by extreme cold and wind. She could hear the blizzard raging outside, a constant roar of wind and the occasional crack of tree limbs breaking under ice and snow load. But inside her cabin, something remarkable was happening. Despite the extreme conditions outside, the cabin felt stable and warm. Margaret's fireplace was burning at a moderate rate, not the desperate wood-consuming inferno she'd maintained during previous severe cold, just a normal winter fire. And the cabin was holding 64 degrees. She walked through the room, touching walls. They were warm to the touch, not just not freezing, actually warm. The heat from her fire was bleeding through the cabin's log walls as it always had, but instead of escaping directly to the 26 below air outside, it was bleeding into the 4-foot air gap between cabin and metal shell. Margaret put on her heavy coat and boots and opened one of the small access hatches she'd built to enter the air gap. The rush of cold air that came through was shocking. The gap wasn't heated, but it wasn't 26 below either. She crawled partially into the gap with a lantern and a thermometer James had left her. The air temperature in the gap read 46 degrees. 46 degrees, 72 degrees warmer than the outside air. The heat escaping from her cabin was filling the gap, and that warmed air was creating an insulation barrier that prevented further heat loss. The system was working. Not marginally, not barely, working spectacularly. The metal shell that everyone said would conduct cold directly to her cabin was instead protecting the cabin from wind. The air gap that skeptics said would waste heat was creating a thermal buffer that made her cabin dramatically more efficient than conventional construction. Margaret crawled back into her cabin and sealed the access hatch. A surge of vindication, mixing with the practical realization that she needed to conserve this heat for however long the blizzard lasted. The storm continued. Temperature dropped to 30 below on January 16th, then 32 below on January 17th. The wind never stopped, a constant, violent force that bent trees and created snowdrifts 12 feet high in places. And inside Margaret's metal-wrapped cabin, she maintained 64 degrees with moderate firewood consumption. She wore normal clothing, not the layers of heavy coats and blankets that had been necessary in previous severe cold. She moved freely through her cabin without needing to huddle near the fire. She cooked, mended clothes, read, and managed her indoor tasks in genuine comfort while the worst blizzard in years raged outside. 3 miles away, Robert Chen's family was fighting for survival in their conventional cabin. Robert had prepared well. He had plenty of firewood, good supplies, a solid cabin with recent chinking repairs. But none of that was adequate against 4 days of 30 below cold and relentless wind. His fireplace consumed wood as fast as he could feed it. Robert burned through 3 days of normal firewood supply in the first 24 hours. Maintaining a fire hot enough that the stones glowed, and despite this desperate effort, his cabin struggled to maintain 42 degrees. His wife Elizabeth and their 3 children wore every piece of warm clothing they owned, multiple layers, heavy coats, wool hats, blankets wrapped around their shoulders. They huddled near the fire because moving away from it meant immediate discomfort. The children's breath frosted in the air despite being 10 feet from a roaring fire. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, Robert's youngest daughter, Anna, who was 6 years old, started crying from the pain of being cold. Not crying because she was scared or uncomfortable, crying from actual physical pain of prolonged exposure to cold that her young body couldn't handle. Elizabeth held Anna as close to the fire as was safe, trying to warm the girl's hands and feet, and looked at her husband with an expression that mixed exhaustion and desperation. How much longer can this last? I don't know. Maybe another day, maybe more. We have firewood for maybe 2 more days at this rate. After that, Robert didn't finish the sentence. After that, they'd burn furniture, then structural wood from the cabin itself. Then they'd face choices he didn't want to think about. This scene was repeating across Montana territory. Families burning through wood supplies at unsustainable rates. Children suffering from cold despite fires that consumed everything burnable. Adults making calculations about how long they could maintain inadequate heat before resources ran out. On January 18th, the 4th day of the blizzard, Sarah Henderson's brother Thomas decided he needed to check on Margaret. The widow living alone in her bizarre metal-wrapped cabin, surely she was in desperate condition or worse. Thomas told his own suffering family he'd check on Margaret and possibly bring her back to shelter with them, even though they could barely keep themselves warm. The journey of 3 miles took Thomas nearly 3 hours. The snow was waist-deep in drifts. The wind was strong enough to knock him down twice, and the cold was so intense that despite heavy clothing, Thomas could feel it penetrating to his core. His face went numb within minutes. His fingers, even in thick gloves, lost feeling. He had to stop 4 times to warm his hands inside his coat to prevent frostbite. When he finally reached Margaret's property, the first thing he noticed was how little smoke was coming from her chimney. A thin, steady stream, Nothing like the desperate clouds of smoke pouring from every other chimney in the territory as people burned wood as fast as possible. Thomas's exhausted mind processed this information with confusion. Little smoke meant little fire. Little fire meant Margaret was freezing or had run out of wood or was in serious trouble. He struggled to the door and pounded on it with numb hands. Margaret opened the door promptly, and Thomas's brain briefly refused to accept what he was seeing. She was wearing a normal dress, not heavy winter clothing, not layers of coats and blankets, a regular cotton dress appropriate for mild weather. Her face was calm, not drawn with cold and stress. She looked warm. "Thomas, come inside, you're half frozen." Thomas stumbled into the cabin and stopped just inside the threshold, his cold, shocked mind struggling to process what he was experiencing. The cabin was warm, not marginally warm, not survivably above freezing warm, genuinely, comfortably warm, like a pleasant autumn day. He could feel the warmth on his frozen face. He could breathe without his breath frosting the air. "Margaret, how? It's 32 below outside." "I know. The metal shell is working. Come sit by the fire and warm up properly." Thomas moved toward the fireplace in a daze, expecting to see a massive inferno like he was maintaining at home. Instead, he saw a moderate fire, normal-sized, burning steadily but not desperately, nothing like the wood-consuming monster his family required. He pulled off his ice-crusted coat with shaking hands and sat near the fire. As the warmth penetrated his frozen body, he started shaking violently. Not from cold now, but from the temperature shock of going from life-threatening cold to genuine warmth. Margaret brought him coffee and a blanket. For 15 minutes, Thomas just sat and shook and tried to comprehend what he was experiencing. Finally, his body stopped shaking enough that he could speak. "Margaret, my family is freezing. We're burning everything we have and my cabin is 40 degrees. My youngest daughter is crying from the cold, despite being right next to a fire. And you're warm. How is this possible?" The metal shell creates a buffer between the cabin and the outside cold. Heat that would normally escape directly to 30 below air is instead warming the air gap. That warmed gap insulates the cabin. The system is self-regulating. The colder it gets outside, the more valuable the buffer becomes. Thomas walked through the cabin, touching walls that were warm to the touch. He looked at the moderate fire that was somehow adequate. He tried to reconcile the suffering of his family with Margaret's obvious comfort. "You're using less firewood than me, and your cabin is 20+ degrees warmer. Everyone said this was madness. We said grief had broken your judgment. Sarah said you were going to freeze because of this bizarre structure." Thomas's voice cracked. "Margaret, my family is suffering while you're comfortable because you built something we all mocked. Your family doesn't have to suffer. Bring them here. The cabin isn't large, but it's warm enough for everyone until the blizzard breaks." "You'd shelter my family? After we all said you were crazy? After Sarah tried to convince you to abandon this and go east?" "Thomas, I'm not going to let children suffer when I have warmth to share. Bring your family here. Today, before they suffer anymore." Thomas looked at Margaret, a widow who'd done massive construction work alone, who'd spent her savings on metal everyone said was wasted, who'd endured mockery and predictions of failure, and saw not a grief-broken woman, but someone who'd solved a problem everyone else just accepted. Can other people build this, the metal shell system? If they can get corrugated iron and are willing to do the work, yes. It's not easy construction, but it's not impossible. The blizzard finally broke on January 19th. As travel became possible, word spread through Montana Territory about Margaret Sullivan's metal-wrapped cabin. The crazy widow who everyone said had lost her mind had stayed comfortable during the worst blizzard in years. Her bizarre metal-covered structure had maintained temperatures 20+ degrees higher than conventional cabins while using less fuel. While families across the territory had suffered through 4 days of desperate cold, Margaret had been genuinely warm. People came from 50 miles to see the cabin and understand how it worked. Margaret gave tours, explaining the air gap principle, showing how the metal shell broke the wind, letting people see the ventilation system. Many were amazed, some remained skeptical, but nobody could deny the results. Robert Chen came on a cold February day and asked bluntly, "Margaret, I was wrong about everything. I said you couldn't do the work. I said the system wouldn't function. I said grief had affected your judgment. I was completely, utterly wrong. Can you forgive me?" "There's nothing to forgive, Robert. You were being protective. You didn't want to see a widow hurt herself on a failed project." "But it didn't fail. It succeeded spectacularly. And my family suffered while you were comfortable because I was too conventional to believe something different might work better. You believed what experience taught you. Now you know something different." Over the following year, 5 families in the area built metal shells over their cabins using various salvaged materials. Not all succeeded. Thomas Morrison used thin sheet metal that didn't have the strength of corrugated iron. Peter Johansson built his air gap too narrow. But most carefully executed metal shell cabins worked well. Margaret Sullivan lived in her metal-wrapped cabin for 23 years, until 1904, when she was 57. She remarried in 1885 to a widower who'd seen her cabin and stayed to court the woman who'd built it. They raised 2 children in the metal-wrapped structure. The cabin was used until 1928, when it was abandoned. The metal shell was salvaged. The wooden cabin was torn down. But photographs from the 1890s show Margaret's metal-wrapped cabin, a massive corrugated iron half-cylinder covering a frontier home. Margaret Sullivan built a metal shell over her cabin when everyone said grief had broken her mind. They mocked the construction and predicted she'd freeze. They said a widow couldn't do the work and the system wouldn't function. Then the blizzard came with 4 days of 30 below cold, and her metal-wrapped cabin stayed 64 degrees, while conventional cabins struggled to reach 42. The metal shell broke the wind. The air gap created a buffer zone. The system worked better than conventional construction. Margaret wasn't broken by grief. She was educated by her blacksmith husband, motivated by survival necessity, and willing to try something different when conventional methods proved inadequate. She built something that looked crazy and worked brilliantly. The cabin is gone now, but the principle remains. Conventional solutions aren't always adequate, and sometimes survival requires building something that looks impossible but functions perfectly. Margaret Sullivan knew that in 1881. It took one brutal blizzard for everyone else to learn it.